Hello everybody, welcome back for one last time in 2021. We've got a lot to talk about, so many things. I haven't planned anything, but what I kind of thought we could do over the course of the next hour is look back on what I hope we can all agree, despite what happened in the final race, I hope we can all agree was a wonderful season, and then potentially look ahead to what's a really intriguing season coming up next year with a lot of unknowns and a lot of things that is very difficult to predict. Of course, we'll go wherever you want to go with all of this. So you lead it with your questions. I'll dip in and out, pick a few as I see them coming through. But again, it feels like we've covered most of Abu Dhabi last weekend. I mean, I'll do it if you want to do it, but it feels like we'll be covering the same ground again if we go over all of those controversies and all those decisions, because we kind of did that to death, I feel, last week. So things that I thought we could look at. We can look at the season as a whole, some of the amazing moments that we've all enjoyed, the season as a whole as a moment that we've enjoyed. We can look at some of your special drivers, the fact that Kimi's left. We can look at the two title protagonists. We can look at the tyre testing for next year's tyres that went on straight away after Abu Dhabi, because that happened after last week's stream. And of course, anything to do with next year. New cars, new tyres, some new drivers in different teams. Wherever you want it to go, we'll go there. Let's try and keep it kind, keep it respectful as ever. I know you guys will. And let's try and enjoy the next hour. Welcome back to every single one of you, wherever you are in the world. I really appreciate all your support. I'm going to say this now, all your support from this entire year and over many years. But this year in particular has been a very special year, I think, for Formula One. We should all feel pretty lucky to have witnessed it. And I really appreciate you guys coming back every week. So, with that in mind, where shall we start? We've only got an hour. I am going to keep it to an hour tonight, as opposed to last week where we just ran on and on until Mrs. P jumped into the chat and dragged me away. So, where shall we go? Audi rumours. There's a good one from Twisted Metal. Some interesting Audi rumours. So, I don't have any official line on this. I haven't spoken to anybody particularly in the know on this, but the rumours and the talk are, and it's no major surprise, but that Audi have given their intent to join Formula One in 2026, probably as an engine supplier, with a new set of power units coming in. We knew they've been looking around. We know that there's been some serious interest. There's even been some rumours about how they might come in, whether they'll buy an entire team or whether they might partner up with a team. Still no major details on that, but the rumours, if you believe them, and this has been reported now in the press quite widely, they have given their intent to the FIA that they fully intend to lodge a formal application in the new year after Christmas. So if that's true, brilliant. Welcome another manufacturer into the sport. How they do it, as I say, still up in the air and to be decided. But it's a great one, isn't it? We are looking at 2026, which will be the next batch of power units, for which Audi have been very much part of that conversation behind the scenes in the previous year, 6 months or year, where they've been invited to meetings along with other prospective power unit manufacturers to help shape the regulations and the shape the direction that we might go. They feel like they have got what they wanted out of those discussions. They've got a power unit that would suit their brand, if you believe the reports, that they feel like it's a worthwhile investment to get R&D out of it, but also, of course, publicity. And as I say, we wait the details of that application, if indeed it happens. Right, let me see. Hang on, where else are we going here? Thank you. My wife's at the window. I wish I could turn my camera around right now, because my wife just slammed her face right up against this window in the dark outside and quite frankly scared the shit out of me. And that is getting me back for a video that I did and we watched the other night. Do you remember the video I did at the back of the house in my old pit stop balaclava where I terrified her when she was on a work call? Well, there you go. That was her getting me back. Right. Do you think Ron Dennis has spoken to Lewis? I don't know about that. I'm not sure. I don't know. Ron's the kind of guy who probably would do that, would probably reach out and just give him some words of love and support and you know, commiseration with the way it all played out. So I don't know is the answer, but he's the kind of guy that would definitely do that. Okay, so this is good. Look, it's like a sort of awards night here. Most underrated driver of the season. You feel free to jump in on this as well. Underrated driver of the season. I would say, this is quite tough, you know. I think Esteban Ocon is underrated. I think we've seen some decent, not enough consistency, but we've seen some decent performances out of him. Who else? I think, Pierre Gasly, I'm not sure if he's underrated anymore. I think most people rate him very highly, but I think he's a guy on top of his form. Carlos Sainz, I think, outperformed most people's expectations in the Ferrari this year. Most underrated, what do you think? Anyone got any different views on the most underrated driver in Formula One this year? Ocon, somebody agreeing with there. Leclerc. So Leclerc, is he underrated? I actually thought Leclerc is a highly rated driver, and I wasn't disappointed with his form or his results this year, but I think most people would have expected him, with the experience he had in that Ferrari team and that car, to outperform his new teammate in Carlos Sainz, and he didn't manage to do that. So I know he did on occasions, but not over the course of the season. Carlos Sainz, people saying. Ocon and Alonso, a great pair, absolutely. Sainz, a lot of love for Carlos Sainz out there. Tsunoda's underrated. What do we think of Yuki Tsunoda? I think he's got great potential, partly because he's clearly got speed on occasion, partly because he's got, I think, a great attitude, a refreshing attitude coming into the sport as a rookie like that. But has he got enough consistency? It's his early days in his career, so perhaps it's not to be, it's to be expected to have a few ups and downs in your first year. So let's give him a bit of time before we judge his consistency. But he's definitely got speed. Here we go. It didn't take long, did it? Massey's performance in Abu Dhabi. Thank you very much. I suspect there'll be a few of those. Lando, Russell, George Russell. Is George Russell underrated? I'm not sure he is, I think he's got a seat at the top table next year because he's very highly rated. Obviously a very good driver, very quick, and I'm really excited to see what he can do next year. So not sure he's underrated, would be my view. Lots of love for Carlos Sainz then, as that. I saw another one. What should we go for? There was another kind of question here, which is almost like an awards night. No, that was it. Most underrated driver. So, let's see. Where else should we go next then? Lewis and Toto missing the award ceremony on Thursday night. Should we talk about that briefly? Because I'm sure you've all read the stories now. They obviously didn't turn up. They announced beforehand, or Toto announced beforehand, that neither of them would go. And technically, that is a breach of the sporting regulations. It's that very same regulation which was the reason that if Kimi was in line for third or fourth in the championship, he'd much rather come fourth, so he didn't have to bother going to attend the FIA prize-giving night, which was his worst nightmare. So yes, the top three are obliged in the regulations to turn up, and in theory, if you breach the sporting regulations, you can be referred to the stewards, although I'm not even sure how that works, because which set of stewards you get referred to. Essentially, there is potential for Lewis to be penalised. I'm not sure whether Toto's obliged to be there as the winning constructor. I think he probably is, or at least they might have to just have a representative, so he might be okay. But in theory, Lewis could be penalised. Will he in practice? Who knows? I really hope they don't do that after everything that happened, but that's one to keep an eye on. We'll have to wait and see. What's your take? Giovinazzi is an underrated driver. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think he came really good towards the end of his stint at Alfa Romeo, Giovinazzi. I think he had a shaky couple of years, but actually got his head down, learnt a lot alongside Kimi, and on many, many occasions in this season just gone, outpaced Kimi. I think he did really well. So yeah, I'd agree with that. Underrated driver, Giovinazzi. What's your take on the Hamilton-Russell duel? Let's go there. And we are all over the place tonight, aren't they? But I like it. This is good. Hamilton versus Russell next year, and I suppose we can lead this question on to, is Lewis going to come back next year? But let's assume he is. Lewis versus George Russell, I think, is a really intriguing battle. One of the things that stood out for me in Hamilton versus Verstappen this year, two incredible drivers, both incredibly fast with great cars on different days at different circuits. The thing for me that perhaps edged it for Lewis Hamilton in terms of the one set of skills that Max certainly couldn't possibly have, is his experience. Lewis has a wealth of experience that clearly no other driver on the grid, certainly not in terms of his teammates or championship rivals, could match. And that could be the difference, because George Russell's going to be the same. He clearly can't match the experience of Lewis Hamilton. Will he match him for speed on certain days? I absolutely think he will. I suspect he will on many, many occasions. Valtteri Bottas didn't he? On many occasions. But over the course of a season, he wasn't able to put it together consistently enough to challenge for a title in any of his years at the team. Lewis did that repeatedly. Made very, very few mistakes. And that experience is all part of that. So George Russell has a lot to learn in that regard. But I do think that on certain days, he's going to push Lewis massively. And on some occasions, I'm sure, will outperform him. It's going to be a really intriguing battle, that one, both in terms of on track and also mentally. How are they going to face off against each other? George Russell knows that he's potentially the future of that team. So he needs to go in from the off and start building the team around him. Just gently, but he needs to start gathering support. I suspect he'll do that through his driving, but also because he's an incredibly nice guy, he'll start making friends, he'll start including people, showing his gratitude for everybody and what they do and all the things that the best drivers do, and he'll start to try and win support within the organisation. And it could be that battle, not necessarily next year, but over the next couple of years, that might shape the future of that partnership. We'll have to wait and see. So let's quickly cover, will Lewis be back? My short answer is absolutely. I cannot see Lewis going anywhere. I know that he was disappointed clearly and understandably off the back of the weekend. Of course he was. I'm sure he feels disillusioned with this sport and the people that are running it. But he's a Formula One racer. He'll be intrigued as anybody about the 2022 cars. He won't want to make that his last appearance in Formula One, I think. Look, I think I've got half an inkling that if he'd won it on Sunday last week, maybe he was going to walk away. Maybe he was, had it in his mind he might retire. I don't know, but maybe. But now things have changed because now he's got something to fight back against. He's probably angry. He's got a new teammate that maybe he'll want to prove himself against. Some brand new cars to experience. A whole new era of Formula One, which I'm sure he will want to just taste, even if just for a year or two. We'll have to wait and see. But does anyone honestly think Lewis will retire in the coming weeks and months? Let me know. Yes, Lewis still has a 2-year contract. Gary Pokey Snow. I appreciate he's got a 2-year contract, but we know contracts mean very little. Nico Rosberg also had a contract at the point where he retired too. So that's not the thing that would stop him. But I do think he would also have some loyalty to his team after all these years, having seen the impact that Nico's shock retirement had, and perhaps he wouldn't want to inflict that on a team that he clearly loves. So we'll have to see. Right. Okay, which track are you most looking forward to next season? That's good. I'm obviously intrigued about Miami because it's a brand new one, and I'm really kind of keen to see how that plays out, how the Americans embrace Formula One, how Formula One puts on a show to try and entice more Americans to get involved in our sport. So definitely quite intrigued for that. Where else am I? I think, all the regular circuits that we all know and love. Silverstone, I love. Suzuka, amazing racetrack. I think, I actually really enjoyed the Saudi Arabia track. I think there's scope to improve it with changes to DRS and stuff like that, but that's actually really cool, although it's not on the calendar next year, is it? No, my mistake. I think there's a number of places that I'm really looking forward to, but with Miami being the brand new one, I'm very intrigued to see how that plays out. Spa, says Kev Duckworth. Obviously, I love Spa. All the big hitters I really, really enjoy, and I'm keen to see the brand new cars take on all of these circuits because what we know and love about a certain circuit with the current generation of cars might be a little bit different with next year. They might have different characteristics that suit certain racetracks and perhaps, differently to others that they've had this year. Maybe there'll be racetracks where we've never really been able to overtake, and yet next year maybe we can because of the new generation of cars. That's also quite an intriguing thing about next year. We'll have to wait and see. Yes, John Webster points out that Spa has new alterations, of course, so there are some changes that we'll get to see next year with the new cars too. Thomas Pachero, will you be at a track next year? Listen, I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes. I actually haven't made any firm plans yet, but there are a few loose plans in the background. I don't think I'll be at very many, unfortunately, just purely because I don't have time, but I definitely want to get back to 1 or 2 next year. So yes, there are some plans in the background just sort of coming together now. There's an impossible question. Who had the better car, Mercedes or Red Bull? I mean, that's the beauty of this season, wasn't it? Because on some days it was the Mercedes and on other days it was the Red Bull. I think, look, the Red Bull proved to be a stronger car for much of the season, certainly the early part of the season. I think Mercedes developed their car into a point where it came back much stronger towards the latter stages. But they had a weak point in terms of the engine, didn't they? Red Bull seemed stronger in that regard. So there's nothing between those two. And the beauty was they were so different to each other with such different characteristics and such different strengths and weaknesses. It's a bit like comparing two drivers. You know, they had certain days where one car was clearly better than the other. And on other days, it completely turned on its head. And those kind of seasons are what we live for. That's amazing. That's exactly where we want this whole melting pot in Formula 1 to. That's what we want it to churn out. Is a mixture of cars that have similar levels of performance, but on different days, one might be stronger than the other and vice versa on another day. Great championship for that very reason in my book. Will Russell and Bottas have an instant impact on their respective teams? That's a good point. Yes, I think so. So let's look at Bottas. I think Bottas is going to come into that Alfa Romeo team really hungry with a point to prove. And if you think about the guys that were there previously, I don't think Kimi had any point to prove. I don't think he's had a point to prove for years and years and years. He loved getting in the car and driving it on the racetrack, but was he passionate about developing it and about developing a team? I'm not sure to the same extent. Valtteri will want to build that team around him. He wants to establish himself, as a clear number one driver. He hasn't had that for years at Mercedes, and that's an opportunity for him to do so. So in that regard, he's definitely going to make a big impact, I'm sure. He'd be foolish not to try and do that. So that's what he'll set out to do. George Russell, I think, will invigorate Mercedes, and whether he has an impact or what impact he has, we'll yet to find out, because that will largely depend on his results on the racetrack. Secondly, I suppose, how he works with Lewis Hamilton. We know that Valtteri and Lewis gelled really well, perhaps because Valtteri was no major threat to Lewis in the long term, and so Lewis was very, very open and friendly with him. And I wonder if that would change if George Russell does start to pose a regular threat to him. If he's the young pretender, if he's the young kid coming onto the scene, looking, sniffing around, waiting to take Lewis Hamilton's throne, like a sort of young lion coming into the pack to take on the established elder. If that's what Lewis feels like, if he feels a threat, then I wonder how that dynamic will play out. That's going to be fascinating to watch. So much to look forward to next year, I think. Bottas to race director. I don't think we've had that one this season. So yeah, well done. Well done, Mr. AJ Scotty. Like that. Okay, here's another award. I like it. I like this awards night. Fire in your options for awards. How about this then from P1? The award for the most impressive team outside the top 2 this season. That's good. And I am going to go with most impressive team. Oh, do you know what? I think Ferrari have come back in the second half of this season really strong. But in the first half of the season, I'd probably said McLaren. So that was a tale of two halves, wasn't it? In that was a tight battle between the two. I wonder if Ferrari have cost themselves development time on the 22 car because they focused a bit more on the 21 car, and that's where they edged the championship over the second half of the season. I wonder whether McLaren might benefit from that in terms of next year's performance. Only time will tell. But both of those teams had incredibly strong halves to the season, but then kind of swapped over as we got to the halfway point, which is a strange kind of phenomenon, wasn't it? Okay, McLaren, says Brian Ganger. Alpine, that's a good one. Alpine were good, I think. better than expected on many, many occasions, but again, it came down to consistency. They didn't manage to do it week in, week out, and on some weekends, I mean, they just went missing. On others, they're challenging for podiums and race wins. So, yes, they had a better season than I would have predicted they were going to have. But yeah, there's a few teams I think that were underrated or certainly outperforming each other outside of the top two. Ferrari, McLaren, and perhaps Alpine. AlphaTauri, of course. I mean, goodness, we're going to name them all here. AlphaTauri also had some really strong results, but I think I expected more consistently from them. They had some great showings, not just this year, but last year too. I kind of hoped they'd step up and bring that week in, week out, and they didn't quite manage to do that. So, again, inconsistency is their weak spot over the course of this season. Do you think Zandvoort will have a sprint race in 2022? Do I think Zandvoort will have a sprint race? I don't know is the answer. Would it be a good place to have a sprint race? Maybe actually. I mean, it's typically not a great overtaking spot. However, the Banks corners did offer some different varying lines through certain turns. So I think the race was better than many people expected it to be. Many people thought it'd be a constant procession. But does it offer enough opportunity to give people the chance to go for risky manoeuvres, which is what you might have to do if you're going to try and move up in a sprint race? Not so sure. So not sure it would be the best place, but we'll have to wait and see. Right. Red Bull engine next year, good or bad? CG Deluxe. Good. I think it'll be good. I think Honda have... Essentially, it is still a Honda, isn't it? It's the same engine, just developed. Honda are bringing a developed version of what they had this year. Presumably, you'd hope, their best ever engine. This year was a great engine. They're delivering something brand new to Red Bull before they then hang up their coats and off they go out the door. So Red Bull should have a very, very strong engine next year. It'll be called a Red Bull, or whatever they end up deciding to call it. It may not be called a Honda, but essentially it's still a Honda. Right. Hopefully some more manufacturers follow Audi, says Mystic Mushroom. Yeah, that would be good. I mean, I think Audi or somebody from that Volkswagen Audi group, and that may well be another brand from that group that still comes in. Porsche are still kicking around the outside, and it's not inconceivable to think that Audi or the VAG group, VAG, could come into Formula One with two brands, at different teams, branding power units in two different guises at two different teams. That's not unthinkable. That could still happen. Okay. Do you think Ron could ever be race director, and how do you think he would do? Oh my goodness, can you imagine it? First of all, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I also, can you imagine the radio communications? Do you think Michael Massey's communications are a bit harsh and abrupt and funny on occasions to the teams? Can you imagine the Ron speak on the radio between the teams on the pit wall? That would be hilarious. I can't see that ever happening. I think he'd do a pretty good job because he's a very methodical guy. Don't think he flusters too much under pressure. So in that regard, he's probably got some of the traits required. Right. Will Andretti buy an F1 team? Again, dunno. It's been rumoured for a long, long time. There's been some serious talks, but those talks broke down, as we know. Will it still happen? Look, I listened to a podcast recently. A friend of mine did a podcast with Mario Andretti, and he talked so fondly about Formula One and about trying to break into it. I wouldn't write it off yet. Let's see. Right, how many cars are the maximum you'd want to see on the grid? So 20 at the moment. I mean, I don't think too many more, personally. And actually, the biggest challenge with all this is not just space on the racetrack, which, of course, we've seen on many occasions this year we're limited by, particularly in qualifying when cars are bunching up trying to get themselves a lap. But actually, garage space and infrastructure is a bit of an issue for Formula One. The Formula One teams take up, a considerable number of garages for each team. It's not just one garage for each car on the grid. They take up more garages than that because they have storage space, tyres to house in the garages too. It's a big operation. So actually, you could probably get to 22 cars relatively easily with a bit of a reshuffle. Beyond that, you're going to start walking into some challenges at certain circuits about whether you can actually fit everybody in. So probably 22. Right, 24 maximum, says Clansom. Okay, what development characteristics of the 2022 car interest you, says the fun guy. Good question. So, do you know what I'm actually most intrigued about is the new tyres. I mean, we'll get onto the cars as well. Obviously, they're really intriguing. There's the aero challenge on the F1, the new cars, is massive. But actually, there are so many other challenges. The tyres themselves, in fact, we should get these out. This is the last opportunity that I'm going to have to dig out these absolutely pointless toy Pirelli tyres for this year, because after that, they're going to go to these low-profile versions, aren't they? We're going to see next year. So it's that I'm really intrigued about, those low profile tyres on the much bigger rims. The challenge that presents the teams is considerable, really quite big. You know, we obviously had tyre testing this week. Teams tended to have a relatively positive response, although it was just on mule cars and a very initial look at them, a reasonably positive response in that they got more or less what they expected. But we're going to get tyre pressures being able to be dropped a lot lower because there's much more integrity in the sidewalls, these shallow sidewalls. So whilst it seems remarkable that we run around with Formula One cars running pressures at 23 psi that we've had on occasions at the rear, 21.5, 22 at the front, we should see those coming right down to more normal pressures, more normal racing car pressures of 16, 17 psi, which is what most motorsport teams are well used to. So that's a challenge in itself, generating heat in those without the movement that we got in the current sidewalls. And then without those flexible balloon type sidewalls that we have, the challenge then throws itself inboard to the suspension, because a lot of that compliance that a Formula One car currently has comes from those big balloon squashy tyres. You see them wobbling in the slow-mos over the curbs, or all of that's going to go, or most of that's going to go. And therefore, that compliance that we still have to have, so the car doesn't shake itself to bits, and to be able to control the dynamic state of play of the car in terms of ride height, pitch and roll and weight transfer, that all gets then fed through to the suspension, which means the engineers now have a challenge or a task which they haven't really had to the same level before, of managing all of that compliance with components that they design and operate. Now that's a great challenge, because the engineers love to have these things under their control as opposed to a tyre that someone else has designed and manufactured. So they love the challenge, but it's a big one, and teams will struggle, or they will certainly have an opportunity to do a better job than other people in getting to grips with that very, very quickly. It's a massive design challenge, and then of course how you operate it over a race weekend, how you adjust it, how you control those various dynamic movements of the car through this different type of suspension they're going to have is going to be a big one. And then of course there's the aerodynamic side of things, which is brand new in the most part for most of these. Well, it's the brand new for everybody, of course, in these cars. But, you know, Formula One teams have learnt an awful lot over the previous years about things like sealing diffusers aerodynamically and blowing exhaust gases into places where they can be beneficial. All of these tricks and you know, tricks of the trade that they've developed on the old cars, you're not going to suddenly unlearn that. So many of those are going to somehow be integrated together with all the new tricks that can be found on the new set of regulations. So it's a massive challenge. It can't be underestimated how big a challenge this is, developing a huge amount more of the downforce from the underside of the car, hopefully creating a much less effective wake behind the car that will have a much smaller impact on a car chasing, and therefore we should get, in theory, much closer racing. There'll be much less outwash. Much of the furniture around the barge boards and front wings are all going to be gone. They're going to look much cleaner and simpler. From a mechanic's point of view, it might be a bit easier from that regard. Certainly from a repair spares man on the team, they shouldn't have to carry anywhere near the number of little detailed flick-ups and flaps that they've been carrying before that constantly get broken up. So there's a massive engineering challenge on every single element of this car. And let's not forget a driving challenge that has to match all of that. The team and driver then have to work together to get a clear understanding of what's happening. The driver doesn't know what to expect fully yet, so they're going to be learning as they go. Their feedback, in the most part, will be based on their previous experience of a Formula One car. It might be that young drivers that are coming into the sport, fresh, without the baggage, if you like, of the old way of doing things, might have a slight advantage in this regard. We'll have to wait and see. Right, moment of the season. Non-league football fan. Moment of the season. For me, it was Lando taking pole in Russia. Yeah, that was great, wasn't it? The McLaren 1-2 in Monza was, for me, just on a personal level, was very special to see. To see many of my friends finally having something to properly celebrate. You're right though, Lando getting pole position in Russia was also brilliant. Any other big moments apart from the last weekend? I mean, look, Esteban Ocon's result, Fernando Alonso's podium was also great to see him so excited about a third place. I thought that was very special. Big moments of the season, any others? Fire in yours, I'd love to know what they are. We'll come back to big moments. Keep firing in the big moments of the season. But quickly, Chipsu315 says, is it the end of DRS? Not initially. So DRS will still feature on the cars, but there's definitely a mandate to stay that if we don't need it, it will go. Not immediately, but in future years that will go. That's part of the plan. The idea is, hopefully, the regulations are so good, we don't need it, and therefore we can let it go. So that's the idea, but we'll have to wait for that. Back to these big moments of the season. Russell second in qualifying at Spa. Yeah, big moment that. Great to see that happening, wasn't it? Really good. Brazil was a huge moment. Of course it was, says Ali W. Brazil as a race was just massive. Had all sorts going on. So many did, didn't they? Freddie Ramos, George qualifying in Spa. Yeah, lots of you saying that. Alonso versus Hamilton in Hungary. McLaren 1-2 was massive. Silverstone also, I mean, the opening lap at Silverstone was a highlight for me until it all went wrong and we lost Max from the race. But those opening corners, the start and the opening half of the lap, I thought was brilliant racing. Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton in Abu Dhabi. Whether you agree with that tactic or not, what epic racing that was. Wheel to wheel between two great drivers that lasted for 3 or 4 corners. I thought that was brilliant. Okay, season opener. Yeah, that was good. Charles's pole at Monaco. Yeah, that was interesting, wasn't it? After he stuck it in the barrier. I don't believe for a second he did that on purpose, by the way, but interesting nonetheless. Perez's win in Baku. Yeah, also brilliant. Look, there were so many, weren't there? There were so many big moments. The Saudi Arabia collision. Absolutely. Okay. Now, there was another question I just flew by here. Could 22 be Haas's last season? Do you know what? It could. It really could. But I've thought that every year for a while now. They are perhaps the most precarious team. They're also probably the team most rife to be purchased. If anybody wants to come into Formula One as a new manufacturer, and look, they're not going to do that until we get these new regulations up and running. But if a new team wants to come in, there's a prohibitively expensive fee that has to be paid to all the other teams to come in as a brand new entrant. Whereas if you buy an existing outfit, you negate those hundreds of millions that you would have otherwise had to pay. So someone, if they want to come into the team, like an Andretti, for example, would have to buy a team in order to do it, and Haas would be the most likely scenario for that to happen. They have been for a few years struggling financially, just getting by. Race by race, almost season by season. Right, hang on, where are we? Haas could be sold to Audi. Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean exactly. So Haas could be sold to a prospective new entrant, whether it's Audi or somebody else. We'll have to wait and see. Will the budget cap limit how many quick mid-season design changes will be able to be implemented in 22? Well, the truth is, it depends how you manage your budget, of course. But yes, obviously, spending is going to be limited. And for the big teams who've been used to bringing whatever they want, whenever they want, they have to think a lot more carefully about that. Of course, that's happened already this season. But this next season coming, we're going to see an even bigger impact with that because we've got brand new cars. And if you discover something you've missed or you see something that another team is running, of course, that could be a massive opportunity, a massive loophole that someone else has exploited that you potentially haven't. And therefore, if it brings huge performance to the car, you kind of need it. And therefore, you might have to spend money that you weren't necessarily banking on. So teams will have budgeted a certain amount for this kind of thing. So they'll have a development budget, of course, in their overall budget. But you've got to play within the rules. And so, yes, they are going to be limited in what they can do. You just got to hope they kind of budgeted it as well as they can. Top 10 driver standings for 22, says Eric Shun. There's no way I can answer that. And that's not me. Well, it is me copying out the question, but there's no way to answer that. And that's what makes it so good. You know, if you'd asked that over the past few seasons, maybe you'd had a fair idea, wouldn't you? You'd certainly be able to predict within some accuracy the top 5 or 6 cars, at least, drivers, even if not the order. But next year, we just don't know. And I think that's what's so good about this season coming up. Right. What do you think about Vettel this year? Good or bad, says Mr. Klotz. I would say disappointing, but I'd say Aston Martin as a whole were disappointing. I kind of hoped that Vettel would just be rejuvenated going to Aston Martin in a big way. I thought we might see a completely new Sebastian, and maybe we have to some extent, but not enough. And he hasn't had a car underneath him enough to really set the world alight, which is what, you know, people would love to see. So disappointing to some extent, but clearly not all his fault. Right, do you know what Alpine's L plan is? I do not. Okay, more cooperation between F1 teams and sim racing, like recent Mercedes W12 introduced to the racing world, would be great to bring this sport even closer to the masses. Yes, that's absolutely true. Now, I happen to know that there are some big advancements coming in the F1 game this coming year, and they're going to be quite exciting, I think, really interesting at least. So that collaboration between F1 and its teams and the video game makers and the sim racing makers, I do agree with you. It's a great way to bring the sport, make the sport more accessible to people that, you know, can't afford to get behind the wheel of a real racing car, can't afford to get to a race. For some people, can't even afford to watch the coverage these days. So to get access through things like the Netflix show and things like sim racing or gaming is actually a really nice way to do that. And that should be, and I think should be, and is being expanded even more and more. So yeah, I agree with you. A really good thing that we should make more of. Right, what do you think about the entrance fee for new teams? Well, as I said, I think it's huge. It's very deliberate, of course, because F1 at the moment doesn't want new teams coming in. So it's almost prohibitive, and deliberately so. If somebody really wants to join, well then great, they can pay hundreds of millions. But in reality, I can't see anybody doing that. And that, I think, is the plan. Right. Okay, will some driving styles be stronger next year with ground effect? Yes, this is a big part of it. As I was saying, you know, the drivers have a huge challenge on their hands to get to grips with these new cars. They're going to need a very different way of driving them to get the absolute maximum out of them. And obviously the teams have got a challenge to develop the car in conjunction with the driver. So yeah, absolutely, we might well see, like we've done in previous years, certain drivers finding that transition easier, others finding it more difficult. Maybe the youngsters, like I said before, who are not weighed down with so much experience in the old way of doing things, perhaps they're going to be more adaptable, but we'll have to see. All right. Do you think Drive to Survive needs to be adapted for a slightly more realistic representation of what happens? Look, Drive to Survive is hammed up for entertainment purposes, but that's exactly what it's there for. It is not a documentary. It's not, I mean, I know they call it a documentary, but it's not a direct depiction. It's not just a factual depiction of what happens. It's factual entertainment. And the entertainment factor is a big part of why it's so successful. It's reaching out, as well as to us F1 fans, to non-F1 fans and trying to entice them into the sport. And it's doing a really great job of that. So yes, the over-the-top bits of pretend commentary or the over-the-top sound effects and all those different things that you see that we sort of cringe at because we're die-hard F1 fans, they're also part of what brings this massive excitement and grabs people in and hooks them when they stumble across this when searching through Netflix. And for that reason, it's ticking all the right boxes. It's a huge number of fans have come into this sport off the back of watching Netflix. You might agree or disagree whether that's a good or bad thing, but look, we've just given them a fantastic season, despite what happened at the end. Take that to one side. If you stumbled across Formula One off the back of Drive to Survive this season, surely you weren't disappointed and you probably stuck around for the whole year. So it's doing a good job in that regard, isn't it? Right. Are we going to see side skirts again? No. So ground effect today is not the same as the ground effect that we had years ago that was really unpredictable and unstable and dangerous because that was so heavily reliant on the side of those floors being sealed to the tarmac with a physical side skirt that the moment if you hit a curb or the car raised up, you break that seal, you lose all of that low pressure zone underneath the car and therefore all your downforce and the car spins off and into the barriers. So we're not using that. We'll use, in similar ways to we've used in previous years, we'll use aerodynamic side skirts. So will be a lot of work going on to try and seal the undersides of the floor, but not using physical side skirts that you might have seen back in the day. How much slower will the 22 cars be, says Eric Shun. Well, the reality is it doesn't look like they're going to be any slower. We may well even see cars faster than this year at the start of this season, but if not at the start of the season, almost certainly by the end of the season. It's looking like at the moment in early testing, and it is early, simulations of course, the cars are a couple of seconds a lap slower. That's definitely the sort of scope, particularly on a new car, that will obliterate over the course of a season's development, even with limited development that we got. So we could end up with cars by the end of 2022 that are faster than the cars at the end of 2021. And that would be a mind-blowing achievement from the F1 engineering community, given the design parameters that they were all designed to. Brian Granger says, smash that like button, and he's absolutely right. Give us a few likes if you don't mind, that'd be great. Appreciate it, thank you. This is the last one of the year. Come on, you can afford to hit the like button this week. If you've never done it before, do it now. Go on. Nice office mate, says Pavel. Thanks, Pavel. This is my actual house, not my office. My whole house is looking like this. That's something I'm looking forward to in 2022. Hopefully getting my house back. I hope the ability to follow closely will be better, says John Norris. And yes, that is exactly the intention of the 22 cars, that the minimised outwash from the front wheels, the minimised or certainly adapted upwash from the back of the car will have less impact on a car following and therefore allow a car behind to follow more closely without having its own aerodynamics interrupted in the same way. So yes, let's hope so. Will Slipstreams be more effective? Will they be more effective? Will they be more effective? They shouldn't be that much more effective. They might be more effective by a small amount, but what will probably happen is the distance at which you get that slipstream will change. In fact, that will definitely happen. So at the moment where you can start to pick up a slipstream, I don't know how far it is, but it's a long, long way back from the car in front. That distance will change. So that might be an interesting phenomenon at some circuits where we start to see differences with how that works. Whether it's more effective or not overall, I'm not sure. I think we'll have to wait and see on that. Probably not in my opinion, but we'll have to see. But of course it could be more effective if that distance that I'm talking about changes in relation to a particular circuit, whereas actually, if a straight is not long enough, not long enough to get a slipstream effectively off the back of a car today. Maybe it will be off the back of one of next year's cars. So perhaps it could be more effective in that regard. Which designer would you back to master the ground effect effectively? I mean, I don't know. That's again, it's an impossible question, and it's important to note. And this is a really important fact about anybody, these big names in Formula One, particularly on the design front. The big designers of history, the John Barnards, the Adrian Newey's, any of these big names in terms of design, aerodynamic design in Formula One. Not for many, many years have they actually designed an entire car. And even, back in the day, that was quite rare. But today, it's a huge team. It's a massive amount of technology and systems that help to design that car, including AI. So there's many of these things that go into designing a car. So it's no good to point at an Adrian Newey and say, look, will Adrian master it? You could look at Adrian and you could say, Red Bull have been operating with a high rate car for many years. Will that give them an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to next year's cars? And I guess the jury's out on all of that. We're not going to see the massive amount of high rake that we've seen in this year, next year. So could Red Bull be at a disadvantage? But on the flip side, the very reason for their high rake is to try and generate massive downforce from the underside of the car. So perhaps that, on that side of things, and that philosophy could play into their hands a little bit. Who knows? It's a real unknown, difficult to predict. We'll have to wait and see. Right. Will they be able to ditch DRS? So we talked about DRS. The idea long term is definitely to get rid of it, assuming we don't need it, but we'll have to wait and see if it's required, how good these new regulations are. Will Verstappen be able to defend his title in 22? No idea. If Bottas retires, if Lewis retires, will Bottas be called back? So that's an interesting one. Let's get some ideas on that. You can throw these into the pot. Let's just speculate for a minute that Lewis Hamilton retires and decides he doesn't want to come back to this sport that he's now disillusioned with. What do Mercedes do? Do they speak to Alfa Romeo and try and get Valtteri Bottas back? I guess that would be a possibility. Alfa Romeo, I'm sure, won't be happy about it. They'll have to be massively compensated for it. Valtteri, would he want to come back? I'm not so sure, I know it's got the possibility to be a great car on the grid, but he'd come back into a team where George Russell, who's already beaten him comprehensively on that one outing, they were teammates in Bahrain, would he want to come back into that and potentially continue being a number 2 driver? Or is this idea of building a team around him, with him as a number 1 at Alfa Romeo, perhaps even more enticing at this stage of his career? Don't know. So if it's not him, who could it be? Obviously, there's still Nico Hülkenberg kicking around the place, the perennial super sub. Potentially, he could step into the car with experience to partner a new guy like George Russell. Ocon, that's a good shout. Ocon is definitely somebody that clearly has had links with Mercedes, has links with Toto Wolff. Somebody that could be called over. And actually, if you're Alpine, that's maybe not the end of the world. They've got Oscar Piastri, who's literally waiting in the wings, and the whole world would love to see him in Formula One. Just slot him in alongside Fernando Alonso if Ocon was deemed to be needed somewhere else. So that's a really good shout. If that were to, if this scenario played out, Ocon could well be a good shout to go back into or alongside George in the Merc. Van Dorn. So Stoffel Van Dorn, obviously a Merc Formula E driver. He could drop in, as well as De Vries, the other Formula E driver, also on Mercedes books. Okay. I mean, I think, look, the most obvious scenario for all this, I think, is that Lewis will undoubtedly continue, in my mind. But you never know. It's worth having a little joke around with these things and see. David Coulthard to make a comeback, says Luke K. There you go. That would be interesting, particularly as he's still contracted to Red Bull, believe it or not. Right. Here we go. Here's a good one. Dan Hill, 1991. Your best personal Kimi memory. Let's quickly talk about Kimi. I know we touched on it last week, but what a guy, what a career. My personal favourite Kimi moment. I mean, I have got so many, and if you've read my book, I'm sure you'll be aware of many of them. But, well, here's one. I think this is in the book. But we went out to Kimi's house one year at the end of a season, and we went to, or a house that he'd rented in Lapland, and went ski-doing. Off it's minus 28 degrees, so cold that you couldn't survive outside. So we literally dressed up to the hilt with all the gear on, of course, we're well protected. We go off ski-doing, we come back in, park the ski-doos up, everyone piles into the house, and in Lapland, the houses have these warming cupboards to dry all your stuff in. So as soon as you get your massive coat off and your gloves and all that are soaking wet, you hang them in the warming cupboard, you lock it up, and off you go. So everyone comes in, puts their stuff in, disappears off around the house, and all reconvenes for a couple of beers in the lounge. And it's, anyone seen Kimi? Where's Kimi? It's me, where's Kimi? Oh my God, where's Kimi? He's not still outside, is he? People are searching around the house, can't find him anywhere. In the end, people start looking outside and screaming his name. I mean, he'd be dead if he was still out in the snow in those temperatures. And then after what seemed like forever of the entire house of 10 people searching everywhere for Kimi, somebody says, I've got him! I've got him! And of course, he's climbed into one of these warming cupboards in the foyer of the house and just promptly fallen asleep, as he does. So that's a personal little funny moment that brings back some good memories. But there are so many from that guy. He's an absolute legend. One of certainly the driver that I got closest to over my years. So on a personal level, he became a good friend, and I've got a lot of time for him. In the car, as we touched on last week, and won't go too much into it now, but in the time that I worked with him in the mid-2000s at McLaren, I think those were his prime years. I think they were his fastest years, even though he didn't win the title until he went to Ferrari in 2007. I think those days in the middle of the 2000s he had unbelievable speed. I mean, as quick as anybody I've ever worked with over a lap. So yeah, great guy. We will miss him in Formula One, but he is going to enjoy his retirement, I have no doubt. Right, do you think trackside engineers or mechanics need more of a say in how many races there are? Look, I don't think they need more of a say. I just think the sport needs to take them into consideration in terms of not just engineers and mechanics. It's everybody that travels around in this Formula One circus. The engineers and the mechanics have, perhaps some of the toughest times in that they tend to be there some of the longest, working, hardest. But there's lots of other people that set the whole thing up for days and weeks in advance of every Grand Prix. There's truck drivers that on the European races are literally on the road in between races, building and deconstructing motorhomes. And there are so many people that could benefit from some thought being spared for their well-being. And if it's not about number of races, if we want to keep ploughing the races in, perhaps we just need to consider their well-being in how we structure the sport. That's not out of the question either. So we can do as many races as you want, but we might have to make some changes to the way a weekend runs, to the way that teams operate in terms of maybe rotating people. There's a number of ways we can manage it. We just need a clear direction on where it's going to go and how far it's going to go. 23 races next year. I know there's a big turnover of Formula One staff in the pit lane at the end of this season because the last 2 years particularly with the COVID protocols have been brutal on everybody in Formula One. Next year it doesn't look like it's going to change dramatically, and we're even adding in an extra race. So it's a tough life right now, and I don't want everyone to start getting out their tiny little violins and going, oh, poor people. Yes, they're well compensated, but look, they have a very tough work-life balance. If you're a family man or woman, you've got a real struggle to keep that relationship and relationship with friends and family alive during this period of time. Keeping your own mental well-being in good shape when you are living out of a suitcase for that amount of time can be tough. So look, I don't want everyone to suddenly start feeling sorry for them, but they need to be considered, that's for sure. Right, we're almost there. Okay, where should we go? Will Formula One's We Race As One motto continue in the 22 season? I would imagine so. I don't know if there's been any official judgment on this, but yeah, I would imagine so. 5 minutes to go, says McLaren F1 race. Thank you very much. Thanks for the update. Right, someone's saying, please change the batteries in your smoke detector. Someone else said this to me last week. It's not that, it's just that there's no power in here. The electrics are all off. And that is why that I'm running this thing off a very long extension lead. So the power's off, that's why the smoke alarm's chirping. Don't panic. Right, should it be easier to run a team from the US or Japan? Should it be easier to run a team from the US? Should it be from the Far East, the US or Japan? I mean, should it be? Potentially, but the problem with it is, and there's no reason you can't effectively do it. Obviously, a large part of the season is European, but actually these days, you know, it's not. It used to be by far the bulk of the season was European. It's not necessarily anymore. The biggest thing is that the workforce, the specialist workforce that are experienced and knowledgeable in Formula One is based here in the UK and in Europe. So that's your biggest challenge. Suppliers, subcontractors, they're all based here. The motorsport community is here. So if you want to set up a team and run it from a far off location, yes, you can do it, but you've got to create your own infrastructure to support that, and that's not easy. Right, that is about it, guys, isn't it? I want to, here you go, and this I was about to say, but Ian has jumped in and says, Mark, are you going to keep doing Monday nights all winter? So the answer to that is this. I am stopping tonight for Christmas and New Year, but in the new year, if you're up for it, I will get back into this and we'll pick up again early in January, long before racing and testing starts, to just start building the excitement. If anyone's up for it, just shout. If you're not, if you want to wait a bit longer, by all means let me know. I'll listen to all your feedback. Maybe what I'll do is a little poll on the YouTube community tab. Perhaps I'll do that as to when we start again. But I'm keen. I'm up for this. I'm definitely going to take a couple of weeks off. Tomorrow's my last day of official work, where I've got to go anywhere. And after that, I am at home looking forward to Christmas. I hope that you guys all have a wonderful Christmas if you're celebrating. Have a great New Year. And if you manage to get a break, enjoy it. We've had a spectacular Formula One season this year that's had some of the biggest controversies that this sport has witnessed for a long time. Depending on who you support, you will either love or hate some of those. But let's just think about the racing that we've enjoyed between two wonderful drivers at the very front, two amazing teams, but all the way through the field, we've had something spectacular to latch onto, whether you're a fan of anybody. And if you're just a fan of Formula One, I mean, come on, this has got to go down as one of the greatest in history. I certainly think so. I hope you agree with all of that. Thank you so much for all of your support all year. I've got big plans for 2022, some of which include this YouTube channel. So stay tuned for some of that. That's part of what I'm going to be figuring out over the next 2 weeks. Have a wonderful, wonderful time for the very last time this year. Cheers. Thank you very much. And I will see you all very soon in 2022. Thanks, guys. See you later.